Well, good morning, everyone. This is John Craig, and you are with us in this morning's edition of Let Us Reason Together. I am your second day of the week host for this show. It's based off of Isaiah 118, which is, "Come now and let us reason together, says Yahweh. Though your sins are as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they will be like wool." This is where we sit down and reason out current events and cultural shifts. And of course, this week's Torah portion, we can either push back or push through. Nevertheless, if iron does not sharpen iron, sparks will never fly, let alone ever get a fire going. And without a little heat and a good midrash, how will our hearts even ever get soft and moldable enough to be transformed in the way that the Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, wants us to be, and maybe have a little fun along the way. So today is Monday, July the 8th, 2019. It is the 5th day of the 4th month in the Hebrew year 5779, and some people call the 4th month Tammuz. I don't like saying that, so you're going to hear me throughout this month say it's the 4th month. There you go. And did I see? Is it? Yeah, it's the 4th month. Thanks, Mark. It's the 4th month. Because, they didn't name months back then. But moving right along, what are some other things going on? Today is, how about this? Free wind in your wings day. Free. Did you know that wind was free, Sandy? Yes. This is my wife, Sandy, by the way. Miss Sandi Craig, she's one of my co-hosts today. I just want to go ahead. I'll introduce all of my co-hosts today. Miss Sandi Craig, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm glad that you're here. And did you know that wind is free?
You don't want to know where my mind initially went.
I don't?
No.
But maybe they want to know what's going on.
No.
All right. So
Wind.
You're talking about probably breaking wind or something. I don't know. All right. And
Mark's got wind going.
And so, yeah, we've got Mark David Smith from the great state of North Carolina, really close to the border of South Carolina. Good morning, Mark. How's that wind blowing in South Carolina?
It's Fiesta Party Day. Fiesta, party. And the wind, I don't know. I'm inside. I don't know. I have to check.
We're gonna free that wind. Free that wind for you. And then also from the wonderful neighbors to our north in Canada, we've got Rabbi Daryl Weinberg. Good morning, Daryl.
Morning, everyone. Good to be here.
How's the wind in Canada?
It's pretty sedate today. We don't have a whole lot of movement. Our windmills are probably pretty still today, actually.
There you go. Well, I just want y'all to know that I looked it up one time because it gets really windy out here in the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, and I found out that Amarillo, Texas, is the #1 windiest place in America, cities over 100,000. Isn't that amazing? And here we are, and we live here. But that's where we live. And out here in West Texas, 4 of the top cities in America, over 100,000. The top 10 windiest cities, the top 4 are out here in West Texas. So there you go. So if you ever want to come to Texas, just be prepared. But
Mark needs to put his beard in a ponytail thing because it'll be like.
That's right, because it'll get in his eyes. Nothing like the fluttering of hair in the eyes, beard hair. That's what I called it earlier. All right, so how about this? It's Soul Hygiene Day. Soul Hygiene Day. What is that, Sandy?
It's your deal.
All right.
You tell us.
I don't know. I found it. Soul Hygiene Day. In other words, it's a good day to get the soul all cleaned up. There you go, Mark. That's
He needs to speak so he can.
All right. Yeah. It looks like a hair clip. Thanks, Mark. Okay. But hey, since we're all here chattering, guess what day it is? It's Chatterer Day. Chatterer Day. So this is a day that we can literally just chat. All right. Okay. Just moving on. And one other thing that's being observed today is Be a Kid Again Day. And then one other thing dealing with chattering. How about International Town Criers Day? Sandy, could you be a town crier?
No.
All right. Daryl, the city town crier.
Oh, I cry a lot in this town already. So yeah.
I don't think it means quite that, but all right. So daily quotes for Monday, July the 8th, positive quote of the day from Benjamin Franklin. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. How about that? And then funny quote of the day. This is your hint, Sandy. Mitch Hedberg said this. I drank some boiling water because I wanted to whistle.
Why did you nudge me on that?
Because you're supposed to laugh. Yeah, that wasn't very good. How about this? Why is it? What's he talking about? Want to whistle? You know, you put your hot water on the stove and it whistles when it's
in
ready.
The teapot.
Yeah, so it drank some boiling water because I wanted to whistle.
Okay, that's dumb.
All right, just funny quote of the day. Just had to get it. I mean,
Was it funny?
It's a cultural thing, I guess. You have a pot of water.
Why don't you find something funny?
How about love quote of the day? Is this going to be funny? From William Shakespeare. Shakespeare. How about this? Love sought is good, but given unsought is better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Things that make you go,
Yeah. All right. I like this one better. It's the verse of the day. I got this from Revelation 22:17, which is connected to the Torah portion. And it is, the Spirit and the bride say, come. And let the one who hears say, come. And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who wishes take the water of life without cost. I like that. All right. Let the ruach, the wind, the breath of life. Okay. So moving right on. What happened on this day in history? July the 8th. I just have a couple of things in history. July the 8th. It is connected to the Declaration of Independence, which was officially signed July 4th, 1776. 4 days later, Colonel John Nixon gives the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence to an assemblage of citizens in Philadelphia. So the very first public reading. And then in 1913, this day, how about this? Do you know this guy, Alfred Carlton Gilbert? Y'all know him? I don't know him. But
that was Batman's butler.
No.
Alfred.
But Alfred was, but I don't think his name was followed by Carlton Gilbert. But
right.
You'll know what he did by this. He patented the erector set. And it became one of the most popular toys of all time. Did you ever have a erector set, Daryl?
Don't believe so. Nope.
You didn't?
No.
Mark, did you?
Sí, señor. Es muy fun.
I did too. And it actually was handed down. My father had the erector set and he gave it to me. Many, many hours of great fun building that. And if y'all don't know what it was just simply screws, bolts, and all sorts of connections that you can make all sorts of contraptions and fun stuff. It was like pre-Legos.
It was like the metal version of a log cabin set.
Yeah.
And Lego. Yeah.
You were only limited to what your imagination could hold. So, all right. So let's talk about some of these things that are on the lighter side of things. We need to jumpstart our brain a little bit. And here's some famous computer quotes. I got two of them. This first one's by Thomas Watson. And he said this: I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. Yep, Thomas Watson said that in 1943. Can you believe that? How about this? Bill Gates said this in 1981. 640K should be enough for anybody.
A year?
$640K.
Sandy, your response was tenfold better. It was good. That was good.
It's funny because my wife and I actually watched Jobs last night, the biography with Ashton Kutcher.
Right.
So, talking about computers and watching the whole development of the Apple company, it was quite fascinating.
That's very interesting. At one point in my life, I lived in Austin, Texas, and it was time to invest into a computer. I think this was probably like 1991. I was going to get my very first computer, my very first laptop. So I went down because, of course, Dell computers are based out of Austin, Texas. So I went down to the Dell outlet store to find my very first computer. I'd saved up some money. I was so excited about getting my laptop and went down there, and they had two different versions of a laptop. I said, this is great. And there was one that was 20 megabytes, and there was one that was 40 megabytes. And I'm like, oh, man, that 40 megabytes, man, it's just pushing the top of my price, my budget here. But you know what? I talked to my dad, and my dad said, 20 is good. 40 is going to be more than enough. You should be able to do fine with 40 megabytes. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to bite the bullet. I'm going to get the 40 megabyte laptop. And then I got Microsoft Windows and I think I got Word and Microsoft Excel. And guess what? I loaded those on and I had no more room on my computer.
I was just going to say.
That was it. So Bill Gates was wrong.
Our first computer we bought off of Adina's parents, and it was an Apple, and the hard drive had 500 megabytes, and we thought, oh my gosh, this is just too much. But oh my gosh, 500 megabytes is one document anymore. So.
Yep, that we know very much. So we are ready to jump into our next segment, and I've got Sandy ready to jump in there with the Torah portion today. So
you're ready for me?
We're ready for you.
All right. Well, I wanted us to talk a little bit about Moshe and Miriam as mirrors of one another. And let's look at Bamidbar, Numbers 20, verse 1. The children of Israel, the whole community, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there, and she was buried there. Okay. When you're looking at that, we all know the story. We talk about it all the time, but I don't know how often we talk about maybe Moshe and Miriam were mirrors of each other, and that's sort of why we see Moshe react as he does. So let's back up a little bit, because it is said that we know that Miriam led the song once they crossed, but it's also tradition says that Moshe led the men in singing. That's just tradition. But Rashbam, let's go back to Numbers 12:12, when Aaron says, let her not be as one who's dead with half her flesh eaten away. That's Numbers 12:12. Well, according to Rashbam, which is Rashi's grandson, the pronoun there is incorrect. It's not neuter and it's not female. It's actually, there's no way it can refer to Miriam. So if that is the case, then it would be let him not be as one who is dead. So who is it talking of? Because we know Aharon is speaking, so it has to be talking about Moses. So because the pronoun is male there. And so Aaron is pleading that Moshe is that he's not going to be as one who his flesh is half eaten away. Why would it say that? Because Miriam is the one suffering from leprosy. Because Aaron understood that they sort of worked together, that they were like two halves of a whole in the picture of the big picture. And if you think about that, that sort of helps us understand what's happening here, because they're so interconnected. They're a family, and each represents each represents Yah in a different way. But when we also know water is representative of the Holy Spirit and so many things, and Miriam's associated with water. So let's take this a little step further. When you look at what happened when Moshe and Aharon die, we see that there's a mourning period that is that the whole place goes through a mourning period for each of those. But we don't see any mourning period for Miriam. All of a sudden, here Miriam dies, and then we see Moses striking the rock. So when we look at these two things, maybe they go hand in hand, and because it helps explain maybe the state of mind of Moshe, because they hadn't walked through that grieving period, that grieving time for Miriam. And also it helps us understand what is the state of Israel right now. When the water dries up, what's that that's symbolic of? That word is dried up. They are not following and doing, and that word's not alive in them right now. The Torah is not alive in them right now. So we have all these conditions that are coming together. We have the literal physical water that's been drying up, but it represents something spiritual. We have Aaron earlier saying, relating Miriam and Moshe together as mirrors of one another. And so when Moshe is told to speak to the rock, but he doesn't, he strikes it. Maybe that is because there's been a failure to follow that mourning period of time. So because it's not because God couldn't bring water out of any rock. He could do that, right? And not because the people weren't legitimately thirsty. They were, for more than just water. But because Moshe was heartbroken over the loss of his sister. And maybe how many times we're in the middle of something, there's a crisis that's happening, and we carry the attitude, because we've allowed snake eggs that we read in Isaiah to develop in our minds and our hearts. We don't take those thoughts captive, and we bring that into the problem that's in, and then we react incorrectly. And we react out of our flesh, our nefesh, we let our heel lead instead of our spirit, our head. And thus a mess happens. He wanted what he wanted. He didn't want just the rock. Moshe wanted his sister. He didn't want to find just any rock because he was heartbroken over her loss. And he wanted to feel her presence, maybe. He wanted to feel her comfort. And the fury wasn't born of anger, but his fury was born out of grief. And there's a lot more to it, but I wanted to just leave this as looking at it from a different side. And then when we think about it, he wanted her comfort. He wanted her presence. Well, what do we think about that? That also talks about the feminine aspects of Yah, which is the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And so we have the people lacking the word. We have them thirsty. We have them grumbling and complaining. And really, it's because they missed the days of mourning. They missed that time, that grieving period they were supposed to go through. So everybody's reacting out of their flesh, out of their nefesh, because they haven't walked out what they're supposed to. So, and that's what we do too, folks, because time and time again, we carry our baggage with us and put it in the situation we're in, and we react incorrectly towards others or even to Yah himself. So we can discuss that. I could preach another hour on that, but I won't.
All right. Yeah, some really, really interesting points there. And then you threw in the whole aspect of snake eggs, those things that get birthed in our mind or waiting to be birthed that are ready just
must be destroyed.
Must be destroyed, or they'll poison us with a poisonous bite. So some interesting thoughts. Daryl, I'd like to hear what you have to say about what Sandy was talking about.
Well, you really got to feel for Moses, because, here he gets prevented from going into the promised land because of Israel's disobedience. And, nowhere in the judgment does God say that Miriam wouldn't make it in. Now, we understand that she was 127 years old when she died. And, it was, a tragedy for him. But he having to carry the burden of this rebellious nation, and then they were constantly coming against him. And then to have his sister die like that, the judgment on Moses was severe. I mean, as soon as he whacks the rock, God says to him, because you didn't treat me as holy, now you're not going to make it in. And Moses, there was, Ben Kingsley did a movie about Moses, which I thought was much better actually than the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. I think it was much more accurate. And there's this scene that I remember that when he gets angry, he kind of walks into the tabernacle after that. And, he's kind of apologizing and say, God, I really lost it and everything else. And then he stops because it's obviously that the voice of God is speaking to him. You don't hear it, but you just have that stark look of panic on his face as now the judgment came. And he says, you're not going to get into the land now. And Aaron, the same things. The judgment hits all of them. And it's because of the fact that Moses allowed his guard down and he acted in the flesh. And, as leaders, this is something that's very, very sobering for us, that there is never, ever an allowance by God for us to act in the flesh. And one of the big struggles that we've had since we've come up here to plant the congregation is all we had at the beginning were people who would come against us. We really had what was mirroring what Moses went through with Israel on a smaller scale, that everybody who came in, they wanted us to do what they wanted them to do. They weren't willing to contribute. They were constantly acting as thorns in the flesh. We had our own situation we were dealing with. And yet the whole lesson that we had to learn was don't respond emotionally. Now, God hasn't judged us by saying that you're not going to go into the land or anything like that. But when you contrast that with what happened with Yeshua, and right after John the Baptist gets his head lopped off by Herod, it says that Yeshua went out to pray, and obviously he's mourning. Here his cousin gets killed. He knows it's unrighteous. He knows this is a prophet of God. And yet it says the people followed him. And what was his response? It says he ministered to them. So even though his own cousin gets killed, even though he doesn't have time to grieve, and he had every right to say, you know what, just leave me alone, give me time to mourn. And it would have been perfectly reasonable in the flesh to do that. Or he could have turned around and said, we're going after Herod, we're going to bring the whole house down here because of what he's done. And yet what it says that instead what he did is that he saw the need of the people and he ministered to them. And I'm always convicted by that because, man, to be in a time of mourning, and it just shows you that when you're struggling with something emotionally, that's the time you're going to get attacked. Or am I the only one who's ever experienced that before?
No, agreed.
And so, when you're raw, when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, and how many times have we fallen? How many times have we struggled with that? And yet we look at the example of the Messiah, and he did only what the Father expected him to do, which was to sacrifice himself. Again, in that situation, he picked up his cross. He sacrificed his own needs for the needs of the people that God had sent to them. And as leaders, man, that is like, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around that that's the expectation, but there is never a moment that we can think about ourselves.
Yeah, very good. It makes me think about another part that's in this Torah portion, as both of y'all were talking about this in that time of grieving. And then I didn't connect the dots until just now. And it says that whenever you touch a dead body, that you're unclean. You're unclean for 7 days. But when you think about it, that why would you be touching a dead body? Most likely, unless you're in the profession of touching dead bodies, most likely it's because it's a family member. And in the midst of dealing with a family member that's died, then there is a connection. Not only there's a contamination of dead body and decomposition and all that sort of stuff, but our very soul is affected. And so if we're unclean, it means we're to separate ourselves out like that, to allow that grieving process to take place, to take that breathing, take that breath, and walk through it. And I just never saw that connection until y'all, made those points that you were making. Interesting. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, let me ask you, that's the first segment with Daryl on your show. Let me ask you, isn't it nice to not only have a rabbi on your show, but a fellow leader of a congregation here to contribute?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I love Daryl. I love his passion. You guys are okay, but I love Daryl. Anyway, Daryl knows that he's my favorite, unless Melaine is on, and then she's my favorite. Uh, and,
Me too.
I, I can relate in that about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I know I just have to look. In September, I lost my dad. In October, I lost my mom. And the following February, I lost my sister. And through that whole time, I was working as an operations director for two large retail companies, and I worked through it. My sister died in February. In March, the owner sold the business, and I and everybody else there had no idea where we fit in to this big organization that owns several stores and businesses, bought our company, and I'm the operations director, and they have their own operations director over the whole thing. None of us, including me, had any idea what we were going to do, where we fit in. And I had just gone through my father, my mother, and then my sister dying, and I had not grieved through any of it. I think it was just 2 to 2.5 weeks before all of this happened that my sister had passed. And it was rough. And I remember this. I can relate. Sandy, I have never heard anybody in the 22 years that I've been in the Messianic lifestyle and the 30 some years I've been in ministry, never heard anybody relate a Miriam passing and then immediately Moshe with the water. I see it. I this is brand new concept to me. Hadn't thought about that, and it puts a new twist on Moshe and the water story. But with my experience of having 3 out of 5 of my family die within a very short period of time, not grieving them, and then having to go through this major work situation, which is very similar to what Moshe being head over this whole group of people. I was the operations director, head over this group of people also. I only made it about 4 days before I told them where to stick it and walked out. So I didn't have the patience that Moshe did. In other words, this happens with his sister Miriam, and then the people rise up against him, which he was already used to. But even being an operations director of a pretty big company, I was used to people coming against me too. It's just that to be able to have the patience to deal with this. Of course, the next line said, after they came against him, verse 6, I think it says, then Moshe and Aharon went from the presence of the assembly. They went from their presence to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. I didn't fall on my face. I stomped out of the business and told them where to stick it. And so we are, most of the time, I think, even though we are in the will of God, we, in a second's moment, depending on what has come against us, is how we react. Had I not just gone through losing 3 of my 5 family members within 6 months, and this all happened, I'm sure I would have had the patience to go through this. And so the Lord is still going to look at how you're going to handle the situation. And that's another reason why I mentioned having Daryl, who is also a leader of a congregation like you guys are. You are held to a standard, a higher standard of having to react based on the will of God rather than somebody else in another situation. I was in a high part of that organization. I was expected to react in a better way, a more mature way than I did, like you guys are expected by the Lord to react a different way, as Moshe was expected to act differently than he did. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yes.
That's what I'm getting out of it is that we are held to a much higher standard than anybody else.
Well, and James,
Outside of the ministry, outside of business where you're in hierarchy of the business, outside of that, the Lord don't care what you do, but within our ministry he does. Go ahead, Daryl.
well, number one, James says that in 3:1 that not many should desire to be teachers because the judgment will be stricter. And it's not just about what you teach, it's about what you do with what you teach. Right. I always tell people, this is a common refrain whenever I go to churches, my own congregation. I said, God doesn't care about what you know. He only cares about what you do with what you know. And so regardless of whether it's in the workplace or in the ministry or anything like that, or especially in our home life, oh my gosh, the way you treat your family, the way husbands treat their wives, the judgment will be most strict on that. Because like I mentioned on Shabbat, I said, your wife doesn't belong to you. God's only loaned her to you for a time and a season to minister and protect her. Same thing with your kids. They're not your kids. They're God's children. He's just entrusted you to raise them properly. So when you are called into leadership, anytime, I always say that I really worry about people who are going to seminary, young kids who are coming out and they want to go into ministry. It's like you have to be completely delusional to really want to go. Now, I understand being called. I understand being zealous and having this overriding passion, but to want a position of leadership, you have no idea what you're setting yourself up for, because it's going to be like Moses. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be aggravated. You're going to be come against. You're going to be falsely accused. You're going to have a bunch of riffraff come against you and tell you that, You're going to have chorus coming against you. You're going to have the Jezebels coming against you. And you're going to have to sit there and you're going to have to take it. And I keep telling the story that the guy who helped me plant the congregation up here, he led a full-on core rebellion against me for 6 months. And there was this going back and forth, and I would get angry at him, and then he would turn around and he would use that again. And finally, the Lord said, because, I had pushed him out of the congregation, or he had left, and I didn't want to let him back in. And then God said to me one day, let him back in and don't say anything. And I was like, what? Let him back in and don't say anything. And I would he would come in for over a month, sit at the table across from me at Oneg and do every single thing that I told him not to do. And he kept looking at me, waiting for me to react so that he could turn around and use that against me and conspire to get all the people again. Look how mean he is. And I didn't say anything. And it was, after we would come home, I would have to sit there and yell at my wife for a while just to unload, but I couldn't say anything. And then God took care of it for me. But as long as I was acting in the flesh, no matter how wrong he was, no matter how right I was in trying to discipline him and trying to maintain order, God says, it's not your congregation, it's mine. and you have to act in accordance with my will, manifesting the fruit of the Spirit, not the deeds of the flesh. And
That's
that is so hard because, you know, you want to kill these people, or at least I do anyway. And you biblically have every right to get upset if it was your rights. But since we gave up all of our rights to get into this position, you know, God called us into ministry kicking and screaming, a lot of us. I remember when I got the call to ministry the night I got saved, God said, "You're going back to your people." And I hung my head and I said, "Oh, great." I know what that's going to be like,
right.
because I knew what it took for me to come to faith,
Right.
and I was open.
Yeah,
So
you know,
it's hard.
down here in Texas, it's not politically correct to say this anymore because they will give all sorts of connotations, but sometimes you say, "Get a rope."
Well, whatever. I just
All right,
want to,
Sandy.
because to wrap it all up, I just want us to remember that sometimes when the story of Moshe and Miriam shows us that sometimes when we're witnessing anger, it's not really anger that we're seeing. It's really an expression of grief over the loss of something, someone, a dream, a hope, a job, something in their life. And in this case, the whole community was walking through this grieving process and hadn't officially, at least not in scripture, had that time to mourn. And what they had lost is that comforter. They had lost that mother. They had lost that water. They had lost the protector. They had lost that wisdom that came from her. You know, all of those things that are representative of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And there was a loss there. And so you're right. All of you are right. We are held to a higher standard, and we're more accountable. But the bottom line is, are we going to be led by the heel in our flesh? Are we going to check ourselves and hold our tongue, fast our opinion, and realize that we're in an emotional state right now for one reason or another, and then be led by the Spirit, by our head? You know,
I'm just thankful that God is gracious.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to jump into our next segment because I think we might have a little bit of a connection with the Torah portion. And here we're talking about Israel, you know, turning against Moses. We see Moses, you know, disobeying Yah for, you know, not speaking to the rock, but striking the rock. We see all these different things. How about this? I found this interesting article over at charismanews.com. And it says 10 signs nature has turned against humanity. So I thought this is very interesting. And 10 different things. So it's talking about here how this year they've lost an astounding 30% of all the honeybee colonies.
that's sad.
This is what the U.S. Beekeepers are saying. We've lost, and without bees, of course, you need bees for pollination. You need bees to be able to pollinate the crops so the crops can produce, so that we can food. Without food, we die. And they said now normally you'll lose so many colonies every year, but usually I think it's around 20%, and here they lost nearly 40%. So a big change there. Here it's also talking about some other 10 signs. In the middle of the country, farmers are freaking out because of giant black vultures are literally eating their farm animals alive. Have you heard about that one? It says that the vultures are federally protected. The farmers can't do anything about it. And so what they're doing is they're devouring.
That's because there's a lot of them in Congress too.
There you go. And so they're devouring the slimy newborn calves, the full-grown ewes and lambs alive by pecking them to death. And then it goes on and gives some details how they're doing it. But so these vultures are going after the newborns. Then all up and down the East Coast, Americans are becoming victims of the flesh-eating bacteria when they go into the water. And they've got some examples in Florida that particularly, but also I heard a report, it's not just people going into the water. Now there's people that are contracting this flesh-eating bacteria and they're not even going into the water. So
Well, how are they well,
it's getting on stuff, and there's stuff they're touching, then it's getting on their skin and it's eating their flesh. And then also about this, have you heard about the cockroaches? It says, for decades, cockroaches have been multiplying despite our best efforts to eradicate them with insecticides. But now they're developing resistance to our insecticides, and researchers are warning that this will make them invulnerable. So, yeah, so cockroaches everywhere. And they're just becoming resistant to that. How about this? Last week, it was hotter in some parts of Europe than it's ever been before. In fact, in one region in France, the temperature actually hit 114 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really, really hot. I mean, you think about that. That's like Bakersfield, California. I mean, hot. I mean, and yet 114 degrees in France, that's not even desert. So then along the California coast, temperatures have been so hot that mussels, that's not like these mussels, but mussels have actually been roasting in their shells. Because it's been so hot there. Let's say going on, that's along the coastline. And then on the East Coast, it's talking about meteorologists saying some portions of the East Coast could see heat index values of 110 degrees as early as Wednesday. So get ready, Mark. Mark's had to take off for some family-ish things going on, activities. So the East Coast could have some of that. And let's say going on in the middle of the country, absolutely hammered by the wettest year that it's ever experienced. And we know that how that's affected. We've got lots of farmland that could not even be planted this year because it was too wet. And then that the same system will attempt to bring some cooler air down from Canada, which will interact with the heat situated in the Midwest, sparking more storms. And then we've got unusually large hail that's hammered communities throughout the country. I've seen that not only this year, but last year as well. Baseball size hail, just destroying, pulverizing crops and property and that type of thing. And then also with all of this going on, unprecedented flooding in the major rivers. And those rivers are not even going down. So these are just like all these things in nature that are taking place, reacting against us. So, what do you see going on, Daryl? What do you see happening? What's happening in your neck of the woods where you see nature in one way or another affecting things that we have been considering, our lifestyles literally affected. And we'll see that affected with even our grocery store prices by the end of the summer.
Well, we know that there is an agenda for depopulation. I mean, everything that we're fighting against revolves around that. And for the vast majority of churchianity to ignore that, we do so at our own peril. One of the things that I try to emphasize, I speak very candidly about what the enemy's agenda is. We've got the globalists, we've got the Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission. We've got the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and everything else. I've covered actually that in the past couple of weeks in Message. If you really want to know what this is about, they're aiming for 90% population reduction. So what we see with the terraforming, chemtrails, and everything else is that there is a deliberate attempt to create circumstances in the earth that are going to lead to us being enslaved and then ultimately eliminated. And why is God allowing that? Because of judgment. And so it's not necessarily nature per se. Nature is being helped. And since Satan is the god of this world, he kind of runs the show right now until Yeshua comes back and says, out you go. But the reason why we have all of this happening is because we've lost our light, we've lost our salt. And so God allows us, as has been said in the chat, for us to reap what we sow. And, this whole, what's going on the West Coast, for instance, in California, I mean, it's utter madness. medical tyranny, forced vaccinations, and things like that. And you've got the LGBTQ agenda, or whatever it's called now. And we haven't fought hard enough. And so the reason why we're in the state that we're in, and, listen, we've got our prime minister is exactly on the same path that Obama was on. And he's taking his marching orders from, the higher ups there. And he's trying to push this agenda of Islamic migration and abortion, euthanasia, all the death culture. When we allow that and we don't stand up and speak, then we give the enemy permission. See, Yeshua said to Peter in Matthew 16, he says that, who do you say I am? And he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And he says, your name is Peter, and upon this rock, I will build my church. Now, there's all kinds of misinterpretations. It's not talking about Peter himself when he says that on this foundation, or he's talking about his testimony. He's talking about his declaration that Yeshua was going to be, that he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And he says, I'm going to build my assembly, my ecclesia, on that testimony. So when we proclaim Yeshua as Lord and Savior, when we proclaim him as the Son of God, then it says the gates of hell will not prevail. Well, there's only one time in Scripture I have ever seen gates used as an offensive weapon. And that was Samson picking the thing up and, whacking everybody with it. Otherwise, gates are a defensive weapon. So what is it saying to us? That hell is going to be afraid of us, and they've got to barricade us from coming at them. What have we done? We've sat back and we've allowed the enemy to come in and take out us. And we've lost ground. Now we find ourselves in a culture war. Why are we in a culture war? Why is the gay agenda so powerful and having so much influence? They only represent, when this whole thing started, they represented what, 2-3% of the population, if that? Mm-hmm. Let's say it's even 10%. Why is the 10% ruling everything? Why are they able to declare what's it? Because the majority has been silent. And we haven't been praying. We haven't been fasting. We haven't been walking in holiness. And when you start talking to pastors and stuff like that about, don't mention Illuminati. Oh my gosh, you're a conspiracy. I actually had a youth pastor a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about, the whole he says, oh, you're not one of those chemtrail guys, are you? Well, what are you? What would you call what they're doing up there? Oh, it's all natural? Mm-mm. We have a biblical term for that. It's called idiot. Oh, I'm sorry, it's fool. You're denying reality. So I say all of this because if you don't know the enemy that you're fighting, how are you supposed to fight? And so if we're not willing to acknowledge, it's like Milena and I were talking about this last night. We were saying, haven't you read the book of Revelation? And do you think that things are just going, and all of a sudden we're going to wake up one day and we're going to be in the book of Revelation chapter 4? Because we're in chapter 3 right now. We're in Laodicea. But chapter 4, things really start to, but do you think it's just an overnight thing that all of a sudden the switch gets flipped? No, it's a progressive thing. And what the enemy does is he continues to take more and more territory until he says, now we've got power. And so this tyranny that the left, the radical left, has been imposing upon us because we haven't fought back, because we've cowered in fear, because we haven't gone and said, in Yeshua's name, get thee behind me, we've allowed them to take the ground. So that's why nature is rebelling against this, because God says, if you allow the devil to get in, you're going to have all these plagues. He is allowed to do that because we're not under the blood. We haven't repented, and we haven't stood for holiness and righteousness, and we haven't got, put on a holy temper tantrum like Yeshua did in the temple and said, zeal for my Father's house consumes me. There is righteous anger. It's not about our own needs. It's not about our own feelings like what happened with Moses. It's about zealousness for God and his righteousness. And why aren't we picketing the abortion clinics, even though there are laws preventing it? So go to jail. We have people who are willing to do that. When we back down, when we don't stand for what God has told us to stand for, and when we don't move, our foundation is on the rock, upon this rock. And it's talking about a big honking boulder. Peter was just a little pebble Kepha is just a little pebble. When he's talking about the rock, he changes the word, and it's a different word in the Greek for a big rock. Upon the testimony that he is the Messiah, will we stand? It says the gates of hell will not prevail. I'm saying to you today that we need to pick up our lance of prayer, and we need to be going thrusting, and we need to start taking back ground.
Amen. Very good word. Sandi, what are your thoughts about
Well,
these
he
things?
said a lot of what I was going to say in a different way, but you're absolutely right. We need to be on our face. Tova was reminding us that we are to open the gate, for the King of Glory to come in, but we're also to be the gatekeepers to ensure hell doesn't go forth. And I was preaching on Shabbat. The last couple Shabbats, actually, we have become so complacent because we just want word that we as a people aren't doing what we're supposed to do. I don't want to hear anymore that, well, we're Hebrew, so we do action. You want to know something? The majority of the people don't. That's true. They don't. Prayer is important, and we need to do that. Everything needs to be founded upon that, but we need to be filled daily with the Ruach HaKodesh, with the Holy Spirit, walking in wisdom, discernment, and then going forth and doing what we're supposed to do. We need to use our voices and cry out and say, no. Can you imagine if everyone who would proclaim themselves as a believer would arm in arm, become an army of one? What would be accomplished instead of splinter groups? And all concerned about gaining knowledge or doing our own thing. But if we would truly get on our face and pray, and if we would truly be people of action, because the people with the acronym, they do, and they manipulate and they influence. Well, who is supposed to be the influencer? It's supposed to be the people of Yah. We are supposed to be the influencers of society, but we sat back and let enemy take hold of that. Well, how does that change? I hear all the time, well, it is, Yah's coming back, Yeshua's coming back, and so we just need to, it is what it is supposed to happen. Come on, people. It still says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, I will heal their land. It doesn't matter what is to come. We still have that job to do. We are supposed to be, as you began, salt and light. What does salt do? What does light do? One little light can pierce darkness, but we let darkness prevail because we don't want to get out of our comfort zone. We don't want to be led by the Spirit. We would rather accomplish what we need to accomplish, do what we need to do because of time, because we're busy, because we are not led by the Spirit. We are led by our busy schedules and the agenda that we have for the day, instead of taking a sit back and say, Father, lead where we're supposed to go. Begin in prayer, but also do what you're supposed to do. Let your voice be heard. The safest place to be is in the middle of his perfect will. And that means if we raise our voice, we can't fear the consequences. We trust him. When he says speak, we speak. Go, we go. Do, we do. And until we as a people will unite and come together, and not just, it's great when we have pockets of people coming together and doing that. But when we literally will become one and start doing it together, things will shift and change. I know I was speaking with Tova, and also Alan was saying that last week, is that this the kind of congregations that we have, like Tova is, that's it's where Tova's at, that life of worship where you're meeting. It's no longer it's not becoming the abnormal thing anymore, because people are flocking to something real. But we as leaders and teachers need to walk out how we're supposed to live and not be so consumed with knowledge. Yes, it's important and it's good to learn, but we've got to have something more beyond that, because the Torah is spirit. And instead of talking that we're Hebrew, so we're people of action, I don't see it. It's time we become people of action. Starts in prayer, on our face, humbling ourselves, but then it goes forth, and we have got to let our voice be known and not put our head in the sand and say, oh, you conspiracy theorists. Come on, people, look and research yourself. There's enough evidence out there that the powers that be are running the show, but that's not the way it's supposed to be, because he who is in me is greater than he who is in the world. I know.
There's never been a conspiracy in the Bible before.
That's right.
I'm amazed at how many believers can deny that there are conspiracies. Yes, we are conspiracy factus. We know that there are conspiracies. Anybody look at Jezebel? I mean, she devised a conspiracy to get what was his name? anyway, the vineyard.
Yes.
Oh,
It was a conspiracy. So yes, the two people have never conspired together to do something evil in history. Come on, like
I
it's
thought
just.
I thought you were going to talk about HRC. Something, I don't know. Conspiracy. I mean, it's all over the news for the last 2 years, right?
Yeah, the whole Russiagate thing and everything else. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And the question we got to ask is, why are pastors, why are Christians so willingly blind to this stuff? Why are we in such vehement denial? And I think it's because, well, number one, I mean, the gospel has been so watered down that we want to focus on grace, grace, grace. We don't want to think that there's any responsibility that we have, which, of course, makes us weirdos, because we actually think that, in a relationship with God, there are requirements and expectations of us. I'm heard, I don't know how many times, that we look at everything, we look at the Torah through the lens of Jesus. Okay, well, what does that mean then? It means we don't got to do nothing. And just the whole accountability thing. But, what is it going to take to wake things up? And what people don't understand, and I think one of the things that people are afraid of, is that when you shine light into darkness, darkness has a way of swinging back. Amen? Mm-hmm. Usually with a good backhand. And it hurts. Because anytime you go into exposed darkness, it doesn't want to be exposed. I mean, what happens when you turn on the light, when you got cockroaches, since we've been talking about them, they run. But the spiritual cockroaches, they usually take out the weapons of the enemy, and they go after you. It's like, if you resist the devil, he flees. But if you resist the deacons, they come at you. I think that's... So, we've got to get back to understanding that, like with Moses, it's not about us, it's about God. But when God sends us on assignment, the only revival I ever see in Scripture from the prophets is Jonah. And he was the one guy that didn't want revival to the people he was called to. It's amazing to me. Every other prophet, we don't see, I mean, even in Jeremiah, you see them talking about in 26 about, Micah prophesied and under Hezekiah, and Hezekiah repented. But we don't see that actually happening. So when the prophets are prophesying, the people are rejecting them. I mean, most of the prophets died a pretty gruesome death. Mm-hmm. And, Yeshua condemns them and says, the prophets were sent, and your fathers killed them. You built tombs for them. And so when we're prophesying, when we're telling people out there, whether it be to the unbelieving world or even in the church, we're not going to be accepted. We understand that. But if enough of us get together and do what Sandi says, and we humble ourselves and pray, God's not necessarily going to heal. Well, we don't have land that's promised to us. The church, we're aliens and sojourners, but certainly revival can break out in small pockets. That promise, I believe, was made to Israel, and so I don't think the church can necessarily claim that. But certainly when you have, like, the D'Souza Street revival, for instance, righteousness breaks out, holiness breaks out, the darkness flees. And what Michael Lake has said is that the devil's power is humanity's sin. And so when sin rises, the devil gets more powerful. We're like his battery. When righteousness breaks out and holiness breaks out, his power decreases, and he's not able to do it, because the devil can only do what we allow him to do and what we speak. If we don't speak sin, if we don't do sin, the devil can't do anything in the earth. He's totally dependent upon us. Nobody realizes that we have that much power. He can't do anything. I mean, yeah, he can make things happen around us, but unless we give him permission, he can't do anything. So why aren't we taking that authority?
Amen. Yeah, it's a big deal. It's, it is really a big deal. And I want to jump into our next segment. I just have to say one other thing. And the sad thing is I won't, the sad thing is not this. The sad thing is when most people won't be a voice. They won't be a voice. They won't take that authority. We've talked about authority and influence, the Shabbat, on the last Torah portion, and the prophets had influence, but they had no authority. So we find their inspiration after they died. and they're still influencing us today. But during that time, there was a totally different time. They were despised. One of the things that we have a responsibility to do is to be a voice. I have been engaging with sending emails to whitehouse.gov and giving my opinion about whatever's going on, because I was tired of being silent and not speaking up, and things have been stirring inside of me for that very thing. It's important that we take that God-given responsibility to begin to speak. And that speaking has to do with and then following up with action. It has to be done that way for us to be able to really start having an impact. Oh, there's so many other different things that's in my mind that I want to talk about, but we can't. We're out of time. We need to jump into the half Torah portion. And so, Daryl, you've got that for us today. And
even though we sprung it on him last minute.
Yeah, last minute. And so he's been doing good jumping in here with all these great comments today. So Daryl, what's on your heart with the half Torah portion?
Jephthah is he's a very, very interesting character. And first of all, it shows you that God doesn't really care about your lineage. He was an illegitimate child, and of course rejected for that at the beginning. But when you contrast Jephthah with his predecessor, Gideon was a very cautious man. And something that Milena was actually mentioning to me last night that really resonated with me is that every step of the way, Gideon had to be assured. He puts down the fleece and then God answers him. And then he says, just in case I didn't hear, do it again the opposite way. And then we have the whittling down of his army and everything else. And it was step by step that God had to lead Gideon. And Jephthah's a different guy. He's a warrior by nature. And even though his family rejected him, so it says that he was pushed away, he ran off, and he was with some men of nefarious character. But when the enemy comes in, they come back to him and they say to him, when the Ammonites come, it says the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob, and they said to Jephthah, "Come be our chief, that we might fight against the sons of Ammon." And Jephthah said to the elders, "Did you not hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you're in trouble? You want me for what I can do for you, not because you wanted me for being me." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "For this reason we have now returned to that you may go with us and fight with the sons of Ammon and become head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." So he says, "If you take me back to fight against the sons of Ammon and the Lord gives them up to me, will I become your head? So am I going to be your leader?" And they said to Jephthah, "The Lord is a witness between us. Surely we will do as you have said." And so that he went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and chief over them. And Jephthah spoke all of these words before the Lord at Mizpah. Well, Mizpah is a very interesting place because that's, of course, where Samuel had his great speech against Israel when they asked for Saul to be king. And so Mizpah seems to be a place, and I'll have to check up the meaning of that word, but it seems to be a place of judgment because it seems to be close to the word mishpat, which is, of course, judgment. And so he goes out, and I mean, he thumps them. And so he sends messengers to the kings of the sons of Ammon, saying, "What is between you and me that you've come to me to fight against this land?" The king of the sons of Ammon said to the messenger, "Because Israel took away my land when they came up from Egypt, from Arnon as far as the Jabbok and Jordan, therefore return them peaceably now. So you took our land." And he says, "Well, actually, no." And, this applies to us today because we see it happening in Israel, the exact same thing. The Ammonites back then are the Palestinians today. "Oh, you took our land." And so I love Jephthah's response. He says, "Well, if your God was so powerful, then wouldn't he give you the land?" I think that's great. What a great response. If your God is so tough, then why isn't he giving you the land? He says, "No, our God has promised us the land." And when they refused to back down, he went out and he laid a good whooping on them. and comes back, makes the silly vow. But whatever comes out of his house first is going to be a burnt offering. Now, as far as I can determine in that, there were only two, because you got to remember that in Jewish households, you didn't live with the animals. They were outside. So there were only two people in the household. That would have been his wife, and that would have been his only child, his daughter. Who was he hoping that was going to come out of the house first?
Oh no! Oh no!
I'm not asking. I'm just asking. But anyway, he makes the silly vow, and then his daughter comes out, and so she ends up having to be a virgin for the rest of her life, not knowing a man. And so they celebrate her virginity every year with a special festival. But the whole lesson that I get out of this is that, like many of the people in the lineage of Yeshua, whether it be Rahab the harlot or Ruth the Moabitess or Tamar, we're not sure if she was of probably not of Hebraic descent. But you have all of these people who wouldn't be considered acceptable in society, whether they're of illegitimate birth or whether they're involved in sinful things, and yet God uses the foolish things of this world to put to shame the wise. And so you have here this bastard son who ends up being anointed, and not only does he go and destroy the Ammonites, but he ends up judging Israel for, what was it, 20 years, 11 years, I can't remember exactly how long. But he was a very effective leader. There was peace under him, and he was a military might. So it doesn't really matter where we are now. It only matters whether we're willing to, number one, submit to the calling, and number two, whether we're willing to allow God to work through us. And even though, his birth circumstances weren't his fault, and he was rejected by his people. And, this is a picture of Yeshua, too, that he is rejected by his people now. And isn't it interesting that in the Talmud, that they have accused Israel or accused Yeshua of being of illegitimate birth? And yet the day is coming where he will be proclaimed king. Jephthah came back and they made him rule over him because they needed him. And, Israel's going to cry out to Yeshua one day because they're going to need him, and he's going to come deliver them, and they will make him his king, their king, rather.
Yeah. Very good, Daryl. Thank you so much. And I'm thinking about, here's Jephthah and his beginnings. He probably had to fight every single day of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody would be making fun of him. He was the brunt of everybody's jokes. He was the one that was left out. He was the one that was beat up. And yet in the midst of those type of trials, it made his character to be the man that he was, that they cried out and said, "You're the one that needs to lead us." He must have made, he learned through the lessons of hard knocks and all that sort of thing, to where he could rise up to be that. And we shouldn't look at circumstances of our life, no matter how difficult they are, as a curse upon us, but that inside of that there's a purpose, and there's a purpose which Yah wants to use to fulfill within each one of us, by which we can grow, by which he can use us in the future. If we reject it and we complain along the way, like the Israelites always were complaining about all of their circumstances, then how many of the Israelites ended up just getting slaughtered by a plague, or by, the snakes, the serpents, the scorpions, whatever it was that were out there. The enemy came in to destroy them because they did not embrace what was presented before them by Yahweh. They didn't live it through, and so they never grew. They never went to that next level. And here, what a story, where out of these small beginnings that Yahweh turned it around to use that and put Japheth in that position. So very good. Daryl, thank you so much for bringing that for us today. We have really come to the end of our, this hour has just gone a little over an hour, but it's just gone by very, very fast. Great show, great input. Really enjoyed it. I just love just sitting here listening. Y'all did good, Sandy. What you brought this today, and we having everybody participate. Wonderful. I do want to mention this as we get ready to close out, and that is that if you go to messianiclambradio.com, make sure you just go there and check in every once in a while to find out what is new here on the Lamb Network. And a lot of new programs are being posted, live shows that are going on every day of the week. You don't want to miss out on that. Of course, you can always go back and check out the archives and see the comments that everybody's saying. And when you're here on YouTube side, you can participate in the live shows with the chat room. So we want to encourage everybody that. And if you like what you heard today, give us a thumbs up and share this on your social media. Let's get the word out about the Lamb Network and the good message that is being presented. So with that said, Daryl, thank you for being part of the Monday edition of Let Us Reason Together. Sure enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be ministering on behalf of the Lord.
Amen.
Agreed.
Yes. And we're touching the four corners of the earth. Sandy, you've got a new show coming up this next week. You want to plug that real quick?
The next chapter, Thursday, 8:45 a.m., same time as this. You don't want to miss it, with my co-host, Joe Cameron and Sherry Flanagan. It's going to be a great show. We've got a lot planned, and we'll plan it and let the Ruach lead and see where we go.
Yeah.
And it's going to be exciting. And Daryl, maybe you'll come on with us one time and be a guest. We would love that.
Anytime. Just give me enough notice.
Even though it would be turned around, instead of 3 guys and a girl, it would be 3 girls and a guy.
Uh-oh.
Well, listen, 3 guys and a girl, it's about even, with that kind of ratio. I'm not sure about 3 girls and a guy, though. There's 2 guys and 1 girl in this household, and we're outnumbered already. So
Very, very good. Very good. Well, hey, we want to just say thank you all for listening today and be part of our program. And thanks to Mark, who's already taken off with his family, do some family things today, and continue to pray for this network. Continue to pray for our leaders that have been given positions of influence around us. And on behalf of the Lamb Network and behalf of Let Us Reason Together, this is John Craig. And until next time, shalom.
shalom.